My father's friend came home in the early hours of the morning to ask for help, and so I could help him. To help you understand better, I'm going to tell it from the beginning, so subscribe to the channel and leave your like. It was a freezing dawn in Brooklyn, with a sharp breeze blowing through the deserted streets of the city, carrying with it the distant sound of cars and the fading light of the street lamps. The clock on the kitchen wall read exactly 2:44 a.m. when the doorbell rang, breaking the silence in the house. The first thing I felt was a shiver run down my spine, a sense of something unexpected about to happen. I was home alone, as I always was at weekends. My father, Arthur, was on a business trip in Chicago, and the house, which was usually so full with the presence of him and his work friends, now seemed emptier than ever. Since he is divorced from my mother and I live with him, the only company was the sound of some old movie on the television and the soft light of the lamp on the living room table. When the doorbell rang, I went to the door without thinking twice, still trying to understand why someone would be looking for me at this hour. I looked out of the window. I saw Robert, my father's old friend, standing in the doorway. He was standing there, his shoulders slumped, as if he were carrying the weight of a difficult night. His eyes were tired, a little red, and his normally confident and controlled countenance was now completely undone. He looked older than his 42 years, and at that moment, he seemed to be broken by something I couldn't understand. I opened the door slowly, trying to hide the astonishment in my voice. "Robert, what are you doing here at this hour?" I asked, still stunned by the unexpected visit. He looked at me with a forced smile, but the expression soon dissolved, giving way to a look of need, of someone who was asking for help without saying a word. He took a step forward, as if to enter, but stopped when he saw me close up. "I know it's late, Thomas, but I need to talk to your father. I need to talk to him now, and I don't know where else to turn." His voice was tense, hoarse, and I could tell that something was wrong. But before I could react, he corrected himself, perhaps trying to control himself. "If he's not here, can I wait?" I looked at my watch, a little disconcerted. I knew that my father traveled frequently, but this was a visit that made no sense, especially at this time of day. He's in Chicago, he's traveling on business. I left the door ajar and stepped back, inviting him in. "I can help you with anything. You don't have to wait, Robert." He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing up the options, but then entered the house. He passed me with a slight inclination of his head, but didn't seem to want to exchange words. I closed the door behind him, and by reflex, led him into the kitchen, where the soft light of the lamp cast shadows on the wall, and the atmosphere was calm, almost silent. The only sound was the blade of the knife cutting the cheese for the snack I had put aside for later. However, now, everything seemed irrelevant in the face of his presence. "I've prepared some food, and if you want something to drink, there's whiskey." I didn't know what to say. The situation was awkward, and he seemed uncomfortable, but at the same time, I felt that something else was behind his visit. Something unsaid. Robert walked over to the wooden chair and sat down with a sigh. He looked exhausted, but somehow forced himself to maintain a facade of control. He picked up the glass of whiskey I had left on the table and took a sip, then rubbed his eyes with his hands, as if trying to shake off the weight of something. For a moment, he was silent, as if he had lost the ability to articulate any words. "Things are bad, Thomas," he finally said, without looking me in the eye. His voice was lower now, almost as if he was afraid someone would hear. "I had a fight with my wife. Things aren't right at home. I don't know what to do anymore." I watched him, not knowing how to react. Robert had always been my father's strong friend, the guy who seemed to have the answers to everything. He always seemed to be in control of his life, always the head of a businessman who knew exactly what he wanted. But now, standing there in front of me, he seemed like a stranger. More than that, he looked like someone seeking refuge, someone who didn't know where else to go. "What happened?" I asked, even though I knew it might not be my place to question him so directly. But something told me that he needed to talk. He needed to get it off his chest. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the empty glass that was now in his hand without even realizing it. For a few seconds he was silent, and I noticed that he was thinking about how to start. When he spoke, the words came out heavy, as if the weight of what he was experiencing had finally found a way to express itself. "I don't know what it's like to be a husband anymore, Thomas. I don't know if it's me, if it's her, but I can't live like this anymore. I'm no longer the man she married. I don't know where I fit in anymore." He looked at me finally, as if he was waiting for an answer, a reaction. I didn't know what to say. How had someone so experienced and confident come to that point? I watched him, feeling a strange mixture of empathy and discomfort. I was caught between the desire to help him, to listen, and the fact that somehow the whole thing was baffling me. Something about the situation didn't make sense, but at the same time, I felt I needed to be there for him. It was then that, perhaps on impulse, or perhaps because of a feeling I still couldn't explain, I found myself asking a question that would change everything. "Robert," my voice came out lower than I expected, "have you ever thought about trying something different?" He looked at me surprised, his eyes a little wide, as if my suggestion had come from a place he hadn't expected. His expression changed to a mixture of confusion and curiosity, but there was also something else there, something that, for a brief moment, made the barriers between us disappear. I watched him, not knowing exactly what he was doing, but for some reason, I felt that the evening would no longer end as we had begun. I was standing next to him, not knowing what to do with my own hands, my mind full of questions that seemed more complicated than the answers I could offer. Robert had always been the strong man, the one who seemed to have everything under control. He was the kind of person my father respected, with a determined look and a solid posture, always ready to solve any problem with a practical attitude. But there, in that quiet kitchen, he looked like a completely different man. Fragile, broken. I sat down at the other end of the table, trying to create a little more space between us, perhaps to give him some relief, or even to give me some emotional distance. I didn't know how to deal with the situation anymore. With every word he spoke, I felt more immersed in something I hadn't expected. Robert was stripping naked in front of me, not physically, but emotionally, in a way I never imagined he would. "I don't know how I got here, Thomas," he said, his voice muffled by the weight of his shame. The drink in his hand was shaking slightly. "It's not just my wife. It's my fault too, I know that. But it seems that the more I try to make things better, the deeper I sink. I don't know who I am anymore." The way he spoke, with a raw sincerity, was almost painful to hear. It wasn't the same firm, determined voice that I knew. It was a voice full of doubt, with a tone of frustration that seemed to weigh even more heavily than the tension in his shoulders. He was giving himself away, and the scene was both disconcerting and revealing. Robert was never the kind of man to express his weaknesses. My father had always admired him for his ability to keep everything under control, to be that steadfast friend, the advisor, the business partner. But there, on that silent night, he seemed completely vulnerable. I watched him, trying to understand what had changed in him. Robert was the kind of person who had never had a relationship with a man. I'm different. I've liked men for as long as I can remember, and seeing him like that made me wonder how good he was in bed. I never wanted things to come to this, Thomas. But life has become a burden, and she doesn't understand. Carol. She charges me for everything I am, but I don't know who I am anymore. I can't be who she expects me to be. Robert stopped talking for a moment, running his hand over his face, as if trying to wipe away something invisible, something that couldn't be seen. I don't know how to deal with it anymore. I knew the situation was deeper than it seemed. And although part of me wanted to offer words of comfort, something inside me couldn't just listen anymore. There was something in me, something that was beginning to awaken in a way that I didn't understand. I didn't know if it was just compassion or if there was something more, a different feeling perhaps, something more visceral, more intimate. I found myself looking at Robert, his eyes tired, his face marked by pain, and suddenly I realized that the distance between us was no longer just physical. Something greater stretched out between us, something that until that moment I hadn't dared to acknowledge. What was happening to me? What was happening to him? It was then that, without thinking, I asked, "Have you ever thought about trying something different?" I asked again. The phrase was on the tip of my tongue, an impulse, an attempt to break through that silent barrier that stood between us. I wasn't sure what I wanted to say, but something inside me pushed me to ask that question. I wanted him to know that I was there, not just as the son of his father's friend, but as someone who could be more than that, more than just a presence. Robert looked at me with an astonishment that I couldn't hide, his eyes wide for a moment, before he looked down, as if trying to understand the meaning of what I had just said. He looked confused, even surprised, but something in his gaze changed. There was a hesitation, a doubt, but also a curiosity, as if, at that moment, he was wondering if this was a chance for something new, something he had never considered. If you're enjoying this story, you can't miss what happens at the end, so leave a like and subscribe to the channel. He swallowed, his fingers still gripping the glass of whiskey. He didn't reply straight away. He stood there in the silence of the kitchen, the tension growing. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what he wanted or what he was thinking. But for some reason, the situation was beyond anything I could control. And somehow, that drew me in. Robert slowly turned his head towards me, his eyes meeting mine for a long moment. He was assessing me now, and what I felt was no longer just curiosity. "What do you mean, Thomas?" He seemed more vulnerable than ever, as if he was willing to listen more, to open up, but unsure if he was ready to move forward. I didn't know what to expect, but at that moment, a part of me already knew that the evening would no longer be like any other. I didn't know what the next step would be, but I felt that I was in uncharted territory, with Robert by my side, and that together we would begin to discover something new, something that no one could have predicted. The clock on the wall read 4:15 in the morning. I knew the night was stretching out, but nothing seemed as clear to me as the weight of the moment we were sharing. The tension between Robert and me was so strong that it was almost touchable. His glass of whiskey was empty, which made me get up and go to the fridge to get another bottle. I knew he wasn't just drinking for the sake of drinking. Robert was trying to drown something inside, a pain. When I returned to the table and placed the bottle of whiskey in front of him, he looked at me again, but this time with a different intensity. His eyes, once lost in some distant point, were now fixed on mine. Robert didn't say anything, but his eyes said it all. He was analyzing my every move, as if he was trying to decipher something that even he didn't understand. Robert's voice came out low, as if he was testing the words before uttering them. I didn't know what he meant, but the way he called me sounded like a silent request, an invitation. I turned to him and our gazes met again. I could have said anything. I could have talked about how he was going through a difficult time. I could have tried to comfort him in some conventional way. But what came out of my mouth was completely different from what I expected. "Have you ever thought about going beyond this?" The sentence came out, not as just any question, but as a statement laden with unexpressed desire. And the moment the words came out, I knew there was no turning back. Robert remained silent. He looked confused, but he didn't move away. His eyes shone for a moment, and I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A reflection of desire, of something hidden that he perhaps didn't want to admit, but which was there, as visible as I was. Robert stood up slowly, his hand gripping the edge of the table. He seemed more vulnerable now, and that attracted me even more. He was no longer the man who had entered that house the night before, full of doubts and anguish. Now he stood before me in a way that seemed almost unrecognizable. I approached him, my breathing getting heavier with each step. The sound of our hearts beating was blending together, as if we were synchronized. When I got within a few centimeters of him, I saw his eyes close for a second, as if he was preparing for something, as if the insecurity he felt was dissolving, being replaced by something more urgent. It was then that I touched him. My hand went to his arm, gently, almost hesitantly, as if to make sure he didn't flinch. But he didn't flinch. On the contrary, I didn't know if he had been waiting for this moment, or if all this was happening just because somehow it was the path our emotions had taken. What I did know was that the distance between us had completely disappeared. Robert was looking me in the eye, his gaze now charged with something much deeper than simple curiosity. He was delivering something to me, something I couldn't ignore. I knew it wasn't just about a momentary impulse. It was about need. It was about something that had developed between us, something that could no longer be ignored. Without any more words, without any more hesitation, I tilted my head towards him, and he did the same. Our lips met softly, a slow approach, but full of intensity. The first kiss was soft, almost hesitant, as if we both still didn't know what it meant. But soon the softness gave way to urgency, and the kiss became deeper, fiercer. The world, that house, everything seemed to disappear as passion blossomed between us. Desire was no longer something I could contain. It was real, visceral. And at that moment, nothing else seemed to matter apart from what we were sharing. The night was ours. When we finally broke off kissing, still panting, Robert's eyes were shining, his expression now completely transformed. He wasn't saying anything, but the way he looked at me said it all. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows, illuminating the room with a soft, golden light, but the feeling in the air was of something still open. Robert and I were changed, and what we had shared, that kiss, still hung over us like an invisible presence. He was standing by the table, his hands in his jacket pockets, his expression distant. Robert was looking out of the window, as if he was looking for something outside, something to get him out of that room, out of that situation. But he knew I knew that there was no escape. What had happened between us could not be ignored. Nothing would ever be the same again. I didn't know what to say. There was something in Robert's eyes, something in his posture, that made it clear that he was struggling with a maelstrom of feelings. He hadn't physically moved away from me, but there was an invisible barrier that I couldn't overcome. He was lost, but at the same time, I felt like I wanted to find myself. I wanted to understand what had happened. Finally, he spoke. His voice was tense, hesitant. "Thomas, I don't know what that means. I don't know what happened." I sensed that he was moving away, and that made me take a step towards him. The air was thick with unspoken questions. "I don't think it was a mistake," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the turmoil I felt inside. "I can't deny what happened. I can't pretend that it didn't mean anything to me. And I know it wasn't just about the kiss, but about everything that's happening between us." Robert finally looked at me. His eyes were clearer, as if, seeing me, he was beginning to understand something he couldn't yet verbalize. He looked confused, as if he was struggling between desire and fear of the consequences. I could see the internal struggle, the tension that still held him back. But there was something there, something deep that he couldn't deny. He didn't answer immediately. He just watched me, breathing heavily. The silence between us seemed interminable. I didn't know if he was trying to process what he was feeling or if he was still resisting, but what had happened in the kitchen couldn't be erased, and at that moment, I was ready to accept it. "I know what to do," he said, as he walked towards me and kissed me again. "Tonight, I want you." After he said those words, I realized that this would be the confirmation. I then took him to my room, and there we had non-stop sex. As my father would be back in just 3 days, Robert slept with me right there. And deep down, I knew that the story between Robert and me was just beginning. That's the story, my loves. What would you do if you were in Robert's shoes? Leave a comment, and if you liked it, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel by activating the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. See you tomorrow, and bye-bye.